Welcome to the Public Housing Resident Organizing and Participation Toolkit training series. This training series is based on the Public Housing Resident Organizing and Participation Toolkit, available on the HUD Exchange website. The toolkit includes 9 guides, sample resident council documents, and tools related to tenant participation funds. The toolkit also includes case studies, which are referenced during the training series.
Whether you are newly beginning a resident council or have a long-term resident organization, we hope the trainings and materials will benefit you and your organization. They may also be helpful for housing agencies and community organizations interested in better engaging with public housing residents.
The toolkit does not apply to former public housing that has been converted through the RAD process.
The toolkit has 4 parts. Part 1 includes guides for organizing and running an effective resident council. Each guide has 1 to 2 associated trainings.
Part 2 includes sample customizable documents to help you formally establish and run your resident council. We have grouped these together in the trainings. You will find a training covering bylaws. This training includes information from both the guide to creating public housing resident council bylaws and the sample resident council bylaws. A training on the resident council and housing authority memorandum of understanding, and a training on the sample resident council procedures, which includes information on using the provided sample forms for resident council meetings and the sample forms for resident council elections.
Part 3 is made up of tools for the effective use of tenant participation funds. There is one training which covers the 3 tools provided: the Sample Resident Council and PHA Tenant Participation Funds Agreement, the Budget and Work Plan template for tenant participation funds, and the Tenant Participation Funds Decision Support Tool.
Part 4 of the toolkit includes case studies and profiles of resident councils and PHAs that support resident organizing and participation across the country. While the case studies do not have specific associated trainings, they're referenced throughout the training series.
Throughout this training and the entire toolkit series, we refer to resident councils. You might also call your group of residents the tenant association, tenant council, resident association, tenant organization, or resident organization. It's all the same thing: a group of neighbors coming together as an organization to improve residents' quality of life and satisfaction, and to create a positive living environment.
Resident councils provide a way for you to work and negotiate with the housing agency, collectively address community concerns, and get to know your neighbors.
The goal of these trainings and the toolkit is to support public housing residents in building and maintaining effective resident councils.
Having a resident council allows you to take an active role in improving your housing and community.
Resident councils can
Build relationships and community between residents.
ensure residents understand their rights and responsibilities,
Improve their housing conditions and security.
improve communication between management and residents,
Bring services and programs to the property, such as recreation, food, social services, and health activities, and improve these programs.
and resident councils can impact and improve modernization or development plans.
Resident councils also have obligations, including
Representing all of the public housing residents in the community democratically and without discrimination,
maintaining a functioning resident council that complies with all HUD regulations, the resident council bylaws, and any other governing documents, and to
properly administer resident council funds.
the training series will walk you through how to organize and run a successful resident council so that you can improve your housing and community.
The 9 guides are: Guide 1, Organizing and Running Resident Councils;
Guide 2, engaging residents and representing resident interests.
Guide 3, Holding Effective Resident Council Meetings;
Guide 4, partnering and advocacy with the housing authority.
Guide 5, Advisory Boards and the Housing Authority Plan Process;
Guide 6, partnering with local and community organizations.
Guide 7, Resident Training and Self-Sufficiency Programs;
Guide 8, resident management corporations.
Guide 9, Tenant Participation Funds.
The trainings will then review the sample documents and the tools for tenant participation funds.
We encourage you to complete all of the trainings and share them with other members of your resident council to build your group's capacity. As you go through the training, it may be helpful to have the related guide opened or printed out so that you can follow along with the information.
We'll now go into the first training.
The first two trainings are based off of Guide 1, Organizing and Running Resident Councils, with Part 1 focusing on forming a resident council. As you go through the training, you may want to refer to Guide 1.
This training will walk you through the basics of forming a resident council, including
The roles of the resident council,
federal rules for public housing and resident participation,
how resident councils and the Public Housing Agency, referred to as the PHA throughout the training, may work together,
the requirements of a duly elected resident council.
and how to form a duly elected resident council.
In part 2 of the training on Guide 1, we'll go into the resident council structure and governance. At the end of the second training, you'll find resources related to both trainings on Guide 1.
Key points included in this training.
Resident councils work to improve residents' quality of life and satisfaction, and to create a positive living environment.
Resident councils may actively participate through a partnership with the housing agency to advise and assist in all aspects of public housing operations.
To be recognized by the local housing agency and HUD as a duly elected resident council, your organization must follow guidelines which are spelled out in this training. And importantly,
Across the country, public housing residents are having big impacts in their communities through resident councils.
federal regulations set out guidelines related to resident councils and public housing. These regulations state that the role of a resident council is to improve the quality of life and resident satisfaction and participate in self-help initiatives to enable residents to create a positive living environment for families living in public housing. Resident councils may actively participate through a working relationship with the housing agency to advise and assist in all aspects of public housing operations. These regulations can be found in 24 CFR Part 964.100.
You can find public housing regulations in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. The CFR includes rules published by executive departments and agencies of the federal government. This is sometimes called administrative law.
Most rules related to tenant participation are in Title 24, Housing and Urban Development, Part 964, Tenant Participation and Tenant Opportunities in Public Housing. Subpart A of this section includes general provisions related to resident participation. Subpart B, Tenant Participation, includes the roles and requirements of the resident council and jurisdiction-wide resident council. Under each subpart, there are subsections.
For example, subsection 100 is the role of the resident council subsection. If you want to look this up by number, you would look for 24 CFR 964.100. Throughout the written guides, relevant sections of the federal code are linked. Where applicable, the primary CFR sections for each training are available in the resources section of the guide and the trainings as clickable links.
HUD regulations provide a right for residents to organize a resident council. HUD encourages housing agencies to foster a constructive working relationship with the resident councils. The PHA must
Permit residents to organize a resident council.
provide training and technical assistance to assist residents in establishing and maintaining a resident council. And when requested,
Recognize a duly elected resident council. And
provide the residents and council with their policies on tenant participation and management.
it is worth noting that the PHA can only recognize one duly elected resident council.
Housing agencies with more than 250 units of public housing are further required, and PHAs of all sizes are encouraged to
Provide office space and meeting facilities free of charge to resident councils.
ensure open communication and frequent meetings with resident councils,
Encourage management resident committees to work on issues and plan together.
and to negotiate a partnership agreement, also called a Memorandum of Understanding or MOU with the resident council.
To be recognized by the local housing agency and HUD as an official resident council, a duly elected resident council, your organization must follow guidelines related to representation, membership, having a memorandum of understanding with the housing agency, elections of a board of directors, and governing documents.
Following these guidelines gives your resident council specific benefits, including access to tenant participation funds and better access to your housing agency.
Representation. Resident councils can be made up of people living in one public housing property or development, or a combination of properties.
A resident council must represent all eligible public housing residents and their families, and not discriminate or only represent those who participate.
A jurisdiction-wide resident council, which we'll talk about more in this training, represents all residents served by a housing agency.
To be a member of the resident council, you must live at a represented property, be on the lease, and meet any bylaws requirements.
While the resident council may establish additional criteria for membership and state these in the bylaws or constitution, these rules cannot be discriminatory or infringe on the rights of other residents.
To vote in a resident council election, you must be at least 18 years old or the head of household, who may be under 18.
Election of a board of directors. A resident council must have at least 5 elected board members who are chosen democratically by the members at least once every 3 years. Let's now do a quick knowledge check.
To be recognized as a duly elected resident council, your resident council must
A. Pay dues to the jurisdiction-wide resident council. B. Elect a board of directors at least once every 3 years. C. Have members who sign up with the organization annually. Or D. Meet with the housing authority every month.
We'll take a moment to let you consider your answer.
If you answered B, elect a board of directors at least once every 3 years, you were correct.
If not, you may want to go back and review the slides or guide. The other options may be something that your resident council does, but of the options presented, only having elections at least once every 3 years is required by HUD to be a duly elected resident council.
There are, of course, other requirements.
Governing documents. The organization must have written rules and procedures such as bylaws or organizational procedures that set out how the organization will run.
The Toolkit provides sample resident council bylaws, procedures, and an MOU.
One of these documents is a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, an agreement between the housing agency and resident council.
It is a best practice for all housing agencies to have an MOU with the resident council that describes their partnership agreement. This MOU must be updated every 3 years. Public housing agencies with more than 250 units are required to have an MOU with the resident councils.
For more information, see the Sample Resident Council and Housing Agency Memorandum of Understanding and related training.
These are the basic, simplified steps for forming a resident council. We will go through each of these steps.
First, find out if there already is a resident council. Was there one in the past?
Second, talk and listen to your neighbors to find out their concerns and interests.
Step 3, talk to resident leaders from other properties.
4, plan a meeting.
5, vote to form a resident council.
6, decide on bylaws and procedures.
7, elect a board of directors.
8, and finally, do the work.
Step 1, learn any resident council history. Is there a resident council? Find out if there is or was a resident council by talking to community leaders and your neighbors.
The housing agency can only recognize one resident council at a property at a time. So if there is already a duly elected resident council, you will need to work with the existing organization rather than create a new one. If that council is not very active, you may be able to join and contribute.
Was there a resident council in the past? Who was involved? Some of the people involved may still be around. Find out the history, what they learned, and what they worked on.
Step 2, talk and listen to your neighbors. Go door to door or have a table in the lobby or another prominent place and talk to your neighbors about forming a resident council. Find out what people's concerns and interests are. You can ask neighbors,
Are there issues a resident council should work on? Are there improvements or new programs you would like to see?
Note any issues that should be addressed at the first meeting. Be sure that the interests of different groups of people are included. For example, if there are seniors and families, make sure that there are issues on the agenda that appeal to both groups.
Get the contact information for interested residents and invite them to a meeting.
Step 3. Talk to other resident council leaders. If your area has a jurisdiction wide resident council, it's a great place to connect with other resident leaders. You can find out about meetings through the housing agency.
If a jurisdiction wide council doesn't exist, ask the housing agency to put you in touch with leaders from other properties. You can also connect to resident leaders across the country through national organizations.
For example, the National Alliance of HUD Tenants and the National Alliance of Resident Services in Affordable and Assisted Housing can connect you to other resident leaders.
You can ask these leaders for advice on forming and maintaining a resident council. You may want to invite them to your early meetings to assist you in running the meeting, if possible, or to talk about what their resident council does.
Step 4. Plan a meeting. Choose a date and time that will be convenient for most people. This is something you can talk to people about when you initially do outreach.
Talk to staff to reserve a space for the meeting. Staff may also be able to assist you in creating and printing flyers.
Put up flyers in key areas and, if possible, distribute them door to door. If there are social media sites or email lists that residents use, you can also distribute invitations electronically.
If possible, invite leaders from another resident council or tenant organizer to talk about their experience and give advice.
Remember, you can customize the sample forms for resident council meetings provided in the toolkit.
Step 5. Vote to form a resident council. In one of the first meetings, you can vote to form a resident council and discuss and decide what the primary purposes and goals of the resident council will be, and what the structure of the resident council will be.
Refer to the Guide to Creating Public Housing Resident Council Bylaws for ideas on the purpose and structure of the resident council.
Step 6. Decide on bylaws and procedures. Use the guide to creating bylaws, the sample bylaws, and sample procedures to build your organizational structure.
It will likely be best to have a small group discuss the specifics and bring them to the larger group. The full group may make amendments and will vote to adopt the documents.
Creating the procedures will likely take some time since they're detailed, and you'll want to find procedures that work best for your organization.
Step 7. Elect a board of directors. Following the rules you have set out in your bylaws and procedures, elect a board of directors. The period when you are getting established is a good time to see which members will put in the work and make good resident council leaders.
Use the sample forms for resident council elections to provide notice and invite all residents.
Step 8. Do the work. Once you have a resident council, you can start doing the work. The basic duty of every resident council is to represent the residents. You can do that by working to choose goals democratically. This means actively recruiting and engaging residents to work together.
Get input from as many people as possible and decide as a group what issues you'll take on. The organization can then work cooperatively to address community needs and accomplish its goals. An excellent resident council builds community so that residents want to participate.
Regularly invite residents to participate. To do this, you'll need to set up a regular meeting schedule and conduct ongoing outreach to invite residents to the meetings.
To get started, your organization may want to choose an initial project where you can have concrete results. Involve as many people as possible and hold events that residents can engage with and get to know the resident council.
As residents see their group accomplishing its goals, more people are likely to join.
Of course, while doing the work, the organization must stay in good standing as the duly elected resident council.
Hi, welcome everyone. Please take a seat and we'll get started. My name is Brenda and I live in the building on the first floor. I've been here for 15 years.
And my name is Jose. I live in Building B, and I've been there for 5 years. You've probably seen me outside on the playground with my kids.
As you may know, Green Manor Apartments used to have a resident council, but we haven't had one in a while. I'm happy to see so many people are interested in starting one again.
A resident council is when a group of neighbors get together as an organization to improve our homes and community. We could build more of a sense of community, improve our property, work with the housing agency, and even bring in programs or services that meet the needs of our community.
Let's take some time to get to know each other and hear about everyone's interest in creating a resident council. Can we go around the room and have everyone say your name, which building you live in, and one goal for a resident council? Miss Smith, can we start with you?
Well, yes, I am Miss Smith. I live in the senior building. I used to be the secretary of Green Manor Apartments Resident Council. We had a great group that met regularly with management and had activities for the seniors and families. My goal is to get that going again.
This is a great list. We have both goals for the resident council and some issues that people would like to work to improve.
We'd like to take a little time in this meeting to discuss the structure of a resident council. Ms. Juanita, the president of Two Rivers Resident Council, is here to share her knowledge with us.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm excited for our resident councils to work together in the future. To be a duly elected resident council, you need to represent everyone at the property. At Two Rivers, we have 5 board members who we elect every 3 years. I'm the current president. You'll want board members who will represent all the communities here, who will be positive influences, and who will do the work. It can be hard, but it's rewarding. Mrs. Smith, what positions did the resident council at Green Manor Apartments used to have?
We had a president, vice president, secretary, yours truly, treasurer, and an at-large member.
Perfect. Those are the most common positions. I will pass out some information in a minute that explains each of those positions in detail.
Miss Juanita, your council also has committees, right? Can you tell us about those?
Yes, we have finance, outreach, youth engagement, and management liaisons who meet with our property manager about policies and resident issues. And sometimes we'll have a group come together for something specific, like planting the flower boxes in the spring. Committees are a great way for residents to be involved in issues or activities that they care about.
Wow, that's great. I know there's more we'll need to do to be official. Can you let us know about that?
That's right. To be a duly elected resident council, you will need to have written rules for how your organization operates, called bylaws. You will also likely want procedures, a manual for how to carry out the rules.
I'm going to pass out these sample bylaws and procedures that we printed from the HUD Exchange website. These come from the Public Housing Resident Organizing and Participation Toolkit, which includes additional resources on forming and strengthening a resident council, fillable forms, other sample documents, and more. You should definitely check it out.
The procedures go over the board positions that we were talking about.
We'd like to get a group together that can start going through these and coming up with proposals for what would work for our organization. That group will then bring the ideas back to the full group for discussion and a vote.
Can we get some volunteers? Great! Though we are not an official resident council yet, I would like to make a proposal for our first vote. I propose that we form Green Manor Apartments Resident Council to represent all residents of our property.
I second that motion.
All in favor of forming Green Manor Apartments Resident Council to represent all residents here and improve our homes and community? Raise your hands. Anyone opposed?
Great. It looks like everyone is in favor. The motion passes. We have started Green Manor Apartment Resident Council. We'd like to at least start off by meeting every month. Ms. Taylor in the Property Management Office will work with us to reserve the meeting space and get the flyers out. We have some volunteers who will be conducting surveys to figure out the best meeting time.
It looks like we have a lot of enthusiasm for improving our community. Let's see which projects we can get started on now.
Thank you for participating in the first training on Guide 1, Organizing and Running Resident Councils.
The second part of the training on Guide 1 will go into more depth on the structure and running of a resident council.